Odessa Fairweather was standing in a hallway on the third floor of Ashcombe Memorial when she heard her supervisor say the word that made her stomach drop. Bilingual. Not to her. About her. Whitney Sorrell was 10 feet away, phone pressed to her ear, pacing so hard her heels left small dents in the freshly buffed tile, saying it to someone on the other end like it was an insult. I don't care who it is. I need someone who actually speaks Japanese, and I need them in that conference room in 20 minutes, or this whole deal walks. Odessa kept mopping. She'd been at Ashcombe for 11 years. Mostly nights, mostly invisible, and she'd learned a long time ago that when powerful people were panicking, the smartest thing a woman like her could do was keep her eyes on the floor in front of her and let the panic pass over her head like weather. But this particular storm didn't pass over her head. It stopped, turned around, and looked right at her. You. Whitney lowered the phone. Do you speak Japanese? Odessa straightened up slowly, the mop handle still in her hand, and for 1 second, one single second, she almost said yes. Whitney didn't wait for an answer. She looked Odessa up and down, from the gray in her braids to the rubber soles of her work shoes, and something in her face closed like a door. Never mind, she said, already turning away. Obviously not. And she walked off toward the elevator bank, phone back at her ear, leaving Odessa standing there with 67 years of her life, folded up quiet inside her chest. What Whitney Sorrell did not know, what almost no one at Ashcombe Memorial knew, was that Odessa Fairweather had been speaking Japanese since she was 9 years old, and that in about 90 minutes she was going to walk into a boardroom and save a deal worth $1.2 billion. But we need to back up, because Odessa didn't get there by accident, and she didn't get there because anybody handed her anything. She got there the way she'd gotten everything else in her life. Quietly, alone, and with nobody watching. 6 hours earlier, at a little after 6 in the morning, Odessa was pushing her cart down the 4th floor corridor of the East Wing, the one that connected the old part of the hospital to the new glass and steel tower they'd built for oncology. That tower was the reason for all the commotion. Ashcombe Memorial was 3 days away from signing a deal with a company out of Osaka called Endo Biomedical, a partnership that would bring in a full floor of robotic surgical equipment, the kind used in exactly 4 hospitals in the entire country. $1.2 billion, spread across licensing, staffing, training, and a 15-year maintenance agreement. It was the biggest thing to happen to that hospital since it opened its doors in 1961. And everybody from the janitorial staff to the board of trustees knew that this week, above all weeks, nobody could afford to mess it up. At 7:15, a delegation from Endo Biomedical arrived for a preliminary walkthrough of the new surgical suites, ahead of the formal signing meeting scheduled for 1 o'clock. Odessa was restocking a supply closet 2 doors down when she heard voices drift through the propped open door, a small group of Japanese executives. An American hospital administrator she recognized as Desmond Ashworth's assistant, and a young interpreter in a navy suit standing between them, translating back and forth in a smooth, confident voice. She hadn't meant to listen, but her hands went still on the stack of towels, because the interpreter was getting it wrong. The lead investor, a compact silver-haired man named Ryusuke Endo, whom she would later come to know, spoke slowly and deliberately even in his own language, because he chose every word on purpose, was raising a pointed concern about post-installation oversight. Who would control the equipment's software updates? Who would have final say if something in the machines needed to be recalibrated or shut down? It was, in plain terms, a question about power. After his company's technology went into that building, who actually owned the authority to touch it? His tone was sharp, urgent, the kind of question that ends deals if it isn't answered honestly. And when the interpreter opened his mouth, all of that sharpness disappeared. What came out on the other side was soft and vague, something about scheduling flexibility for future software updates. Not what the man had said, not close. Odessa's jaw tightened. She mouthed the correct translation under her breath, automatically, the way another person might correct a typo they saw on a passing screen. She understood every word Mr. Endo had said, not because a school had ever taught her, not because she'd ever set foot outside the state of Ohio, but because for the better part of 50 years, in one form or another, she had never stopped learning that language. She picked up her towels. She closed the closet door. She walked away, because who in the world would listen to a woman with a mop? To understand how a hospital custodian ended up fluent in a language nobody at Ashcombe Memorial knew she spoke, you'd have to go back to a laundry room in the basement of a much older hospital on the other side of the city in the early 1960s. Odessa's mother had died when she was 6, and she'd been raised after that by her aunt, a broad-shouldered, no-nonsense woman named Odessa Fairweather, who worked as a laundress at that old hospital for 31 years. Same machines, same steam, same ache in her hands every night. Vashti wasn't the kind of woman who complained. But she had a friend down there in that basement, a Japanese-American woman named Amaya Kess, who folded sheets beside her 6 days a week for almost 2 decades. Mrs. Kess's family had been forced out of Sacramento in 1942 and resettled, like thousands of others, far from home, in a city that didn't particularly want them either. By the time she and Vashti met, Amaya Kess had lost her father in a camp hospital, lost the family's nursery business, and rebuilt a life from almost nothing, one folded sheet at a time. She and Vashti understood each other in a way nobody else in that basement did. 2 women the world had decided didn't matter, working side by side in the heat and the steam. Somewhere in those years, without either of them quite planning it, Amaya Kess started teaching Vashti her language. A word here, a phrase there. Something to pass the long shifts. And Vashti, being Vashti, wrote every single one of them down. Odessa grew up visiting that basement on weekends, sitting on an overturned laundry basket while the 2 women worked, half listening to a language she didn't understand yet. When Vashti died, Odessa was 23. She found among her aunt's few belongings a small wooden comb carved with a cherry blossom pattern wrapped in a handkerchief. Amaya Kess had given it to her the year the internment reparations finally passed, a small quiet apology in the shape of a gift. Tucked inside the handkerchief was a note in Vashti's careful handwriting. Amaya taught me the only thing this world couldn't take back from me twice. Learn it. Don't let it die with me. Odessa didn't understand what she meant, not fully, not then. But she kept the comb. And a year later, grieving and broke and working nights to keep the lights on, she found her aunt's library card still active in an old purse, and she started going to the public library on her days off, sitting in the language section for hours at a time, teaching herself from cracked textbooks and, later, from free internet courses and second-hand tape recordings donated to the language shelf. She was 31 before she could hold a real conversation. She was past 40 before she could read a newspaper without stopping. Along the way, she picked up pieces of 2 other languages too, because once you understand that nobody's going to hand you anything, you learn to build your own doors. She kept every note she ever took in a spiral notebook with a cracked cover, held shut for the last 10 years. With a rubber band she'd replaced at least 4 times. Grammar rules, vocabulary, medical terms she picked up working nights at 3 different hospitals over the decades, because eventually the language and the job became the same quiet discipline. One more thing she taught herself in a corner nobody was watching. At 49, she'd applied for an open position in Ashcombe's Patient Services Department. Something closer to the front, something that used what she knew. The rejection letter said the role required formal interpreter certification and a 4-year degree. She folded that letter and put it in the notebook, page 19. It was still there. At 11:30 that morning, on her lunch break, Odessa sat alone in the break room with a thermos of coffee and her earbuds in, not listening to music but to a podcast. A dense, technical discussion, entirely in Japanese, about medical device liability law. The kind of thing a hospital's own legal counsel might study before a negotiation like the one happening 3 floors above her head. She paused it twice to write something in her notebook, the pen moving fast, the pages soft and worn from years of use. At 1:45, she pushed her cart onto the 6th floor to change linens and empty bins in the oncology ward, and knocked twice on the door of room 614 before letting herself in. The room belonged to an elderly patient named Hana Tanaka, in for a long round of treatment, whose daughter had left a folded note on the bedside table in careful, worried Japanese, asking the staff, anyone, please, to keep her mother's water pitcher filled with only room temperature water, because the cold made her mother's throat ache. The nurses on that floor had been guessing at it for 2 days, filling the pitcher with ice water every time, apologizing to a patient who could barely speak English, and had stopped trying to explain. Odessa read the note in about 4 seconds. She poured out the ice water, refilled the pitcher from the tap, sat it exactly where it had been, and wrote a short reply underneath the daughter's note. Polite, warm, correctly formatted with the honorifics her aunt had drilled into her decades ago. She signed it with her first initial only, tucked her cart back into the hall, and moved on to the next room. She didn't know that Corinne Ashby, the night charge nurse who was just coming on for an early double shift, had stopped in the doorway of 614 on her way past and seen the whole thing, seen Odessa's pen moving fast and sure across that notepad, watched her fold it exactly the way you'd fold something you cared about, and stood there in the hallway for a solid 5 seconds with her mouth slightly open before Odessa wheeled her cart out and disappeared around the corner without even noticing her. Corinne had worked at Ashcombe for 22 years. She knew every nurse's coffee order and every doctor's blind spot, and, apparently, absolutely nothing at all about the woman who'd been cleaning this floor for the last decade. She stood there a while longer, thinking about that. 14 floors below, though it was really only 6, but it felt like 14 to everyone involved. The deal was already starting to crack. Ryusuke Endo's frustration had been building all morning, and the interpreter, a young man named Theo Whitfield, who'd been flown in from the firm's Chicago office, kept smoothing his sharpest points into polite mush, the gap between what was said and what was heard widening every time he opened his mouth. Desmond Ashworth, the hospital's chief executive, was 2 floors up in his office, reviewing the morning's translated notes and feeling a low, nagging unease he couldn't quite name. Something read wrong. He didn't have time to chase it down. The meeting was in less than an hour. At 12:30, in the hospital's small ground-floor cafe, one of the younger members of the Endo delegation, a soft-spoken junior engineer named Haruto, sat with his phone to his ear, clearly upset, his voice tight and fast, even though most people around him couldn't understand a word of it. He was telling someone back in Osaka that the interpreter kept softening Mr. Endo's concerns, that the older man was losing patience, that if this kept up, he was going to walk out before the papers were even on the table. Odessa was 3 feet away, wiping down a coffee station, and she heard every word of it. Her cloth slowed on the counter. This confirmed exactly what she'd overheard that morning behind the closet door. The deal was bleeding, and nobody on the hospital's side had the faintest idea. A second delegate walked over to Haruto and asked him, in Japanese, where the restroom was. And before Odessa had time to think about it, before she'd made any kind of decision at all, she pointed down the hallway and answered. Calm, correct, unhurried. Down the hall, second door on your left. 4 seconds. That was the whole thing. Both men froze. Haruto lowered his phone slowly, looked at Odessa's uniform, looked at the spray bottle clipped to her cart, looked back at his colleague, then back at her again, his mouth slightly open. Odessa didn't wait around to see what happened next. She picked her cart back up and walked away at her normal pace, heart hammering under her apron, because 11 years of being unseen teaches a person exactly how to disappear when she needs to. But Haruto didn't let it go. He pulled out his phone again and called a different number this time. He was calling Mr. Endo directly. You might think that was nothing. 4 seconds of directions to a bathroom. But in a room where $1 billion is on the table, trust doesn't come from a slide deck or a signature line. It comes from the feeling that somebody in the building actually understands what you're saying. Not just the words, but the weight behind them. And, after a full morning of being carefully, politely misunderstood, that feeling mattered more than anything printed on the contract. Whitney Sorrell, Ashcombe's Director of International Partnerships, was adjusting a floral arrangement near the cafe entrance when she saw it. Odessa, standing near the coffee station, talking. Not gesturing, not pointing at a map, actually talking, to two members of the delegation who were nodding, engaged, more at ease with her than they'd looked with anyone on the hospital's team all morning. Whitney's stomach dropped. This wasn't admiration. It was fear. A cleaning woman had just done, without trying, what Whitney's entire department hadn't managed to do all week. She crossed the cafe in 6 sharp steps and didn't wait for privacy. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" "They asked me a question," Odessa said. "I was just what? Playing translator? You think because you've memorized a few phrases somewhere, you can walk up to the people who are about to sign a billion-dollar contract with this hospital and start chatting like you're one of them?" Whitney's voice dropped lower, which somehow made it worse. "Let me be very clear. You mop these floors. That is your job. That is the whole of your job. You are not qualified to speak to anyone in this building above the 2nd floor, and you are absolutely not qualified to open your mouth in front of people whose time is worth more than you'll make in the rest of your life. If I see you anywhere near this delegation again, I will make sure you're finished at every hospital in this county. Do you understand me?" Nobody in that cafe said a word. 2 nurses on their breaks stared into their coffee cups. A security guard studied the floor. Odessa stood still, her knuckles white around the cloth in her hand, and after 3 long seconds, she said, quietly, "Yes, ma'am." She walked to the service elevator. She pressed the button. The doors closed behind her, and only then, alone, did she let herself shake. She thought about her aunt's voice, the thing Vashti used to say while they sat in that basement, folding sheets that weren't theirs. "They can take your job, your house, your good name if they decide to. They cannot take a language out of your mouth once it's yours. Say it back to me, Odessa." Odessa had said it back 100 times as a child, without understanding it. She understood it now, and her voice cracked on it anyway. She pulled her notebook from her apron, flipped to page 19, the old rejection letter, still folded exactly the way she'd folded it 18 years ago. She turned to the next blank page and wrote 3 words. "Maybe she's right." Then she closed the notebook and held it against her chest and let the elevator carry her down. 3 floors below, Desmond Ashworth sat at his desk with 15 minutes until the meeting, staring at a translated summary that didn't sit right in his gut, and he had no earthly idea that the person who could fix it was riding down in an elevator with a spray bottle clipped to her belt, telling herself she'd been wrong to ever think she mattered here. Corinne found her 20 minutes later in the break room, notebook closed on the table in front of her, staring at nothing. Corinne had been looking for her since she left room 614. "The family in 614, Corinne said, sitting down across from her. "Mrs. Tanaka's daughter called the nurse's station. She wanted to know who left the note about the water. She said the handwriting was beautiful. She asked for the person by name." Odessa looked up. "I didn't have a name to give her," Corinne admitted, "but I have one now, if you want it used." Nobody in 11 years had ever asked for Odessa by name. She sat there a moment, and then, because Corinne was looking at her with something that wasn't pity, and wasn't curiosity dressed up as kindness, but something closer to plain respect, she opened the notebook and told her everything. The mistranslation she'd overheard that morning, the oversight clause, the interpreter softening every hard edge Mr. Endo tried to put down on the table, the deal cracking apart 4 floors above their heads while nobody with any authority understood why. Corinne listened without interrupting. When Odessa finished, she said, "You have to tell Mr. Ashworth, Ems. Sorrell just told me she'd end my career if I go near that delegation again." "Odessa." Corinne's voice was steady, almost stern. "I've been at this hospital 22 years. Desmond Ashworth is the only administrator I've ever seen who actually listens when somebody tells him the truth. If what you're telling me is real, and I believe every word of it, He needs to hear it before 1 o'clock, not after. She leaned forward. Whitney can try to fire you for speaking up, but if you stay quiet and this deal falls apart because nobody said anything, you're going to carry that a lot longer than you'd carry losing this job. Odessa looked down at the notebook. Page 19. The letter. The next page. 3 words. She picked up her pen and drew a single line through "maybe she's right," and didn't write anything to replace it. Just the line. She closed the notebook and stood.
Which floor is his office on?
Corinne smiled, the first real smile of the whole story. 3rd floor, end of the hall. I'm walking you there myself. Desmond Ashworth's assistant tried to block the door. No walk-ins. He's prepping for the 1 o'clock. Until Corinne said, flatly, she has information about the deal, and I've worked here 22 years, and I am personally vouching for her. The assistant looked at Corinne, looked at Odessa's uniform, and the cart parked in the hallway behind her, and stepped aside. Desmond looked up from his desk when the door opened. He didn't ask why a custodian was standing in his office. He set his pen down and waited. Odessa spoke fast, clean, no wasted words, the way she'd have written it in her notebook if she'd had time. She explained the clause about post-installation control, how the English draft used language about shared technical oversight between the hospital's engineering staff and Endo's team, but the version the interpreter had been feeding the delegation all morning implied the hospital would retain unilateral authority to override the system at will. No shared oversight, no partnership, full one-sided control. 2 very different agreements sitting at the same table, and neither side realized it. Desmond turned his laptop around and pointed at a paragraph in the translated summary his own assistant had prepared. What does this actually say? Odessa read it and translated it back on the spot, fluent exact. Desmond sat back. Then he picked up his phone and had the interpreter's floor access suspended for the rest of the day. He stood, walked around his desk, and looked her in the eye. I need to ask you something, and I need the truth. If I bring you into that room in 20 minutes, in front of my board, in front of a man who's about to decide whether this hospital gets the most advanced cancer treatment technology in the state, and it goes wrong, if you make a mistake, if this deal collapses because of something you say, are you prepared to carry that? Odessa didn't look at the floor. Yes. He held her gaze 3 full seconds. Good. Because if you'd hesitated even a little, I wouldn't have believed you could actually do it. He glanced past her, to where Corinne waited in the hall, and gave her a single nod. Thank you. He walked out beside Odessa, not ahead of her, not behind. He didn't offer her a different uniform or suggest she fix her hair. She walked in the same scrubs she'd been wearing since 6 that morning. The cherry blossom comb pinned quietly in her braids where it had sat every workday for 40 years, because what she carried into that room had never had a single thing to do with what she was wearing. In the corridor outside the boardroom, Desmond spoke without looking at her. My mother scrubbed floors in a Cleveland hospital for 19 years. Different hospital, same floors probably, if you squint. She knew every patient on her hall, their allergies, their family troubles, who was scared and who was pretending not to be. Nobody ever thought to ask her opinion about anything, and she had better judgment than half the doctors she worked under. He paused. She'd have liked you. Odessa touched the comb in her hair. My aunt used to say the people who clean the room know the room better than anybody who's only ever visited it. Neither of them said anything else. They didn't need to. At 1 o'clock, the boardroom doors opened onto a long mahogany table and a wall of windows looking out over downtown Cleveland. On one side sat Ashcombe's leadership, Whitney Sorrell among them, back rigid, jaw set. On the other, 6 members of the Endo biomedical delegation, and at the head of that side, Ryusuke Endo, arms folded, the posture of a man who had already made his decision and was only waiting for a polite moment to announce it. Desmond walked in first. Odessa walked in behind him. Whitney was on her feet before the door had even swung shut. Desmond, what is this? She's custodial staff, I specifically told her, Whitney. Desmond's voice was flat and final. Sit down or leave the room, choose one. Nobody breathed. Whitney sat, knuckles white on the armrests. Mr. Endo stood. He spoke fast, sharp, each sentence harder than the last. Every grievance he'd been swallowing all morning. The sense that his concerns had been softened into nothing, that nobody in the room respected him enough to hear what he actually meant. He finished with 4 words and reached for his briefcase. "It is over." Desmond looked at Odessa. This was the moment. She stepped forward without waiting to be introduced, looked directly at Mr. Endo and began speaking in Japanese. Fluent, unhurried, respectful, and absolutely unshaken. She repeated his concerns back to him first, word for word, exactly as he had said them, not a softened version, proving beyond doubt that she'd understood every syllable. His hand stopped moving inside the briefcase. Then she walked him through the clause itself. The English draft's language of shared technical oversight against the interpreted version's implication of one-sided control. And said the line that changed the temperature of the whole room. "You were not being deceived, Mr. Endo. You were being mistranslated. Those are 2 very different things." He looked at her then, really looked, not at the uniform, not at the cart still parked out in the hall, at her eyes, at the steadiness in her voice. He closed the briefcase and set it aside. "Who taught you to speak like this?" "A laundry room," Odessa said, "and a woman who never once got to sign her name to anything either." The room went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet around something true. Mr. Endo reached for his water glass, the first person at that table to touch one all day, and said one word: "Continue." For the next 40 minutes, Odessa served as the live interpreter for the entire meeting, not just translating words, but translating meaning, softening what needed softening, sharpening what needed sharpening, finding the English shape of a proverb Mr. Endo used partway through so that everyone in the room could feel what he meant and not just hear it. By the end, the water glasses were empty. The tension had drained clear out of the room. Mr. Endo asked to speak privately with Desmond before he left, and when the rest of the room cleared out, he stopped Odessa at the door. "Not you," he said. "You stay." The deal would go forward, he told them, with the language corrected. His team would remain the rest of the week to finalize it properly. But he had one condition. He looked at Odessa, not at Desmond, when he said it. "She is the liaison for this entire partnership. Not offered, named. Every communication between my team and yours runs through her." Desmond didn't hesitate. He nodded once. When the boardroom doors opened again, the hallway outside was packed. Delegation members. Hospital staff who'd heard whispers and drifted closer. Nurses still in scrubs, a security guard who'd abandoned his post at the front desk. Desmond stepped out first and, in front of every one of them, said, "I want this on the record. Today's agreement was saved by Odessa Fairweather, an employee this hospital has had on its payroll for 11 years and never once thought to ask what she knew. That failure belongs to this institution, not to her." Mr. Endo stopped in front of her, in full view of the hallway, and gave a small, deliberate bow, a gesture that in his culture carried more weight than any handshake. Then, one after another, it started. Foster Langley, from the hospital's board of trustees, who had sat silent in the corner of that boardroom all week watching everything, crossed the hall and put his card directly into Odessa's hand. "Call my office Monday." Haruto shook her hand and held it a beat too long. "I knew it," he said. "The second you spoke in that cafe, I knew." Corinne watched from the far end of the hallway, hands gripping the nurse's station counter, tears running quiet down her face. 22 years of being reliable and unnoticed, finally worth something in a way she'd never expected. And Whitney Sorrell, when the crowd finally cleared, was asked by Desmond to stay behind. Nobody heard what was said in that room. 2 weeks later, she was no longer director of international partnerships. There was no scene, no announcement on any board. She was quietly moved to an administrative post at a satellite clinic 40 minutes outside the city, in a building with no marble and no delegation to impress. The official records cited conduct inconsistent with the hospital's values. Everyone who'd stood in that hallway knew the real reason. During her last 2 weeks at Ashcombe, the only route to the parking garage from her new temporary office ran directly past a door with a fresh nameplate at eye level. Odessa Fairweather, Director of Cultural and Patient Liaison Services. She had to walk past it morning and evening, impossible to avoid. On her last day, carrying a box down that same hallway, she passed Odessa coming the other way. They stopped. 3 seconds of silence. Odessa spoke first, calm, no edge to it at all. "I wish you well, Miss Sorrel." Whitney didn't answer. She adjusted the box in her arms and kept walking, her heels fading down the corridor until the sound of them disappeared completely. That was the last time anyone at Ashcombe saw her. Odessa didn't need Whitney to fall in order to rise. But sometimes justice doesn't announce itself. It just puts the right person in the right doorway and lets the silence do the rest of the talking. Corinne was promoted not long after, to a newly created role overseeing patient advocacy across 3 campuses, the exact kind of recognition 22 years of quiet competence had earned and never once received. At the small staff gathering where it was announced, she stood up and said only, "I didn't discover Odessa Fairweather. I was just the first person who didn't look away." 6 months later, Odessa completed a formal certification in medical interpretation and cross-cultural healthcare liaison work, fully funded by the hospital, and spent 3 weeks in Osaka helping Endo Biomedical's team prepare their onboarding materials. The first time in 67 years she had ever left the country. A woman who taught herself a language from library tape recordings and a rejection letter she kept for 18 years had never once seen the ocean that language came from. Now she had. Foster Langley connected her to a small network of healthcare systems in need of exactly the kind of cultural liaison work she did. And within a month, she'd turned down 3 job offers because Odessa Fairweather wasn't interested anymore in waiting for someone else's table to have room for her. She built her own. She founded a small non-profit training program for hospital and hospice workers who spoke a second language nobody had ever thought to ask them about. And she named it after the 2 women who'd taught her everything, in the basement of a hospital that no longer exists. The Vashti and Amaya Language Bridge Program. She funded its first classes out of her own certification stipend in a public library branch 3 miles from where she grew up, in the same kind of language section where she'd once sat alone on a Sunday afternoon with a dead woman's library card and nowhere else to be. You are going to walk past somebody today, maybe tomorrow. Somebody pushing a cart, somebody scanning your groceries, somebody old enough that you've already decided, without meaning to, that whatever they know stopped mattering a long time ago. You'll see the uniform, the gray hair, the tired hands, and you won't see what's underneath any of it. Maybe they buried a language nobody ever asked to hear. Maybe they carry an entire education nobody paid for, and nobody will ever grade. You will not know unless you stop, unless you ask, unless, just once, you choose to look. If you know somebody like Odessa, or if you are somebody like Odessa, tell me in the comments. Tell me what you taught yourself when nobody was watching. Tell me the thing you know that the world decided you were too old, or too tired, or too far past your usefulness to still be carrying. I want to hear it. And if this reached you today, send it to somebody who needs telling that they are not finished yet. That being overlooked is not the same as being empty. Never stop building what's yours even when nobody claps for it. One day it will matter, and you'll be glad you kept going. Don't let somebody else's low opinion of you become the whole truth of who you are. The real danger was never being underestimated. It's starting to agree with them. Speak up even when the room was never built for you. Because silence doesn't protect you. It just makes you slowly disappear. And look, really look, at the person standing in front of you before you decide what they have to offer. Because you would be amazed what people are carrying that nobody has ever once bothered to ask about. The world doesn't owe you an audience for who you really are. But one day, if you keep showing up as yourself anyway, it stops being able to look away.